Okay, let's talk about looking at connections between brain regions and different ways of doing that. So this was a slide from the very first class, I think. And it said, what is the basic way in which you do a kind of very standard fMRI experiment? And in the simplest design, you have what's called a block design, where you have rest and task, rest and task. You might just get someone to tap their finger for 30 seconds and then rest for 30 seconds, something like that. And in the meantime, you're recording time courses from all these voxels of bold signal, blood oxygenation level dependent signal. And some of them sort of go up and down, sort of in sync with the task. And we've now, in the computer practicals, actually seen voxels that actually do look like this. Okay? And others just sort of, well, they're doing something, but they're not really going up and down with the task. So whatever's going on in this voxel, it doesn't appear to be correlated with this. So by that measure, you would say this is an active voxel and this is not an active voxel. Now, in the sense of is there anything going on in this voxel, this is also an active voxel. There's something happening in there. But what is that? Is it noise? Is it response to something else in the environment? Is it somebody thinking about what they're going to have for dinner that night? This actually, we're going to come back to that. That sounds like an offhand comment, but there's a whole theory about what's called, we're going to get to this in a bit, called the default mode network, which is basically sort of the stuff that's in your brain when you're not really busy doing anything else. That might involve you thinking what you're going to have for dinner tonight. So maybe that's this. Anyway, there's something going on there, but whatever it is, it's not correlated with this. So the key measure here is looking at two time courses and seeing as they correlate with each other. In this instance, one of the time courses is your stimulus time course, and this is also something that we've sort of played with in the computer practicals. And you make this, right? You decide when somebody is going to do the task, or when you're going to ask them to do the task, and when you tell them to rest. And you measure this, and you see, how well do they correlate. But you can also, as you might imagine, say, hey, instead of looking at the correlation between a voxel and some sort of task design, I can look at the correlation between two different voxels. And that's actually a very active area of research that we're going to talk about. So here's just some sort of made-up time courses from a couple of voxels. And you can see, well, they kind of sort of correlate with each other to some degree. Okay, so they both sort of go up together a bit here, but then they seem to sort of go out of sync a little bit. Now, if two voxels are both going up and down together in exactly the same way, there's some sort of relation between them. Now, exactly what that relation is obviously a open question. It might mean, well, you tell me. What are some of the things? Suppose you find two voxels, or in fact two time courses of any sort that happen to be going up and down to more or less in lockstep. What are the kinds of things that might mean? Any thoughts? This is not a trick question. There's some obvious ones and there's some sort of less obvious ones. Yeah.
I mean, the obvious ones are one is causing the other.
Okay.
So the fluctuations
That's
that
good.
Produce the fluctuation in second.
Okay, that's good. Just say one obvious one so that someone else gets to say it. Yeah, okay, that's good. So they might actually be, these voxels might actually be talking to each other. Okay, what's another possibility? I think you had to.
I mean, they might be involved in the same task, but doing different things.
Exactly, so they might both be being driven by some external thing. And so, this is a sort of illustration of the extremely overused but nonetheless important phrase that correlation does not equal causation. I was chatting with Dan about this the other day. It's very important to remember, so everything that we're looking at here is all about correlation, okay? It's very important to remember, and we're going to show in a minute a way of trying to pull them apart, but it's very important to remember and not forget that correlation does not equal causation. But everyone kind of knows that, or at least everyone who's involved in science knows that. This is also the kind of thing that you don't want to make the opening sentence of your grant proposal, not just for this, but for anything else, I don't know if you follow any sort of like science journalists on Twitter or anything like that, but they sometimes complain that no matter what article they post about any study, there's always like a whole subpopulation of users who tweet back saying, remember that correlation is not equal causation. And they're like, yeah, we know that, thank you. But it is important to remember. And then sometimes people come out, have you ever seen these things like Google Trends where you can sort of like play with it and get, like different trend lines? And people love to like make things like, you can get Google trend lines that look exactly like something else but obviously have no relation to it. Like there's one popular one of, here's the stock market performance for the last 5 years, and here's a mountain range in Switzerland. Okay, and you can overlay them, and it turns out that they match perfectly. Okay, and so everyone says, so remember, correlation is not equal causation. Okay, and so that's fine. Obviously the mountain range was not causing the stock fluctuations, although it is in Switzerland, so you never know. But it's important to realize that actually the really important time when you've got to think that correlation is not equal causation is when there's some important hidden third thing, right? There's no third factor that's making the mountain range wobble like that and is making the stock market wobble like that. So that's why it's a kind of cute but silly example. Okay? But often there really are important third factors that you might not be thinking of. So my favorite example of correlation not equaling causation, where it actually really, really looked like they were causally linked and it was kind of reasonable for people to think that, but it was totally wrong and lots of people died as a result, is that for a long time people thought that bad smells caused disease. Okay, so there's this thing called the miasma theory of disease, which people actually believed at least until the mid-1800s and even beyond that. So if you're into this kind of thing, there's a wonderful book called The Ghost Map, all about the guy called John Snow who discovered that cholera was a waterborne disease. Anyway, so people were dropping dead of cholera all the time, okay? And these places where people were dropping dead of cholera smelled really bad because they were full of open sewers. Right? And when you get within half a mile of this place when the wind's blowing in the wrong direction and you feel physically sick because there's all these open sewers, and then everyone's dropping dead. So, well, of course they're dropping dead. I feel like sick when I'm even like 100 yards down the street. So it was completely reasonable, especially as a measure of salience. I mean, the thing that hits you is, oh my God, there's an open sewer here, okay? Right? And by the way, back then, most of this was in London, even the rich parts of London had open sewers. Okay, everywhere had open sewers. They didn't understand the importance of it. So when you worry about correlation not equaling causation, it's not just kind of silly examples like a mountain range in the stock market. It's things where things really do look like they go hand in hand, and it's completely reasonable to think that they are actually related to each other. But it turns out it wasn't the bad smells that were killing people. No matter how unpleasant the bad smell was, it was some perfectly nice tasting water that was killing people. And it took a long time for people to realize that. Okay, so that's just a kind of little rant about correlation, but it is relevant to this question of looking at types of connectivity, because there's all kinds of different ways of looking at connectivity. And they all go by different names, and some of the names are sort of, it's clear what they mean, and others it's not. This is, by the way, yet another thing to sort of think about when you're writing, not just this for your project, but for anything else. That just because you know what a particular term means doesn't mean that the reader knows what a particular term means, especially if it's not obvious. So does anyone happen to know, well, I suppose this picture sort of illustrates it, but I always find it difficult to remember what on earth effective connectivity is meant to mean. This is sort of too low down on the slide, maybe you can see this. But so there's at least three different types of connectivity that you might want to look at. And here are some different modalities. I'm going to talk about these in a minute. So we already talked about fMRI. I'm going to talk about what DTI stands for. Here's another thing. Don't use abbreviations unless you're completely convinced that the reader is going to know what they're. So I'm pretty sure that some of you, but not all of you, know what DTI stands for. Okay. And I'm going to tell you what it stands for in a minute. But so here's a brain. And here's different signals and different things happening in the brain. And they're all different measures of connectivity. So we're going to talk a bit about it. So structural connectivity, that at least is a fairly clear label that says, is there actually some anatomical thing linking these two parts of the brain? In this particular case, the structure is white matter tract. Well, white matter is the fiber connections between different brain areas, and they're called white matter because they literally look white. And the thing that makes them look white is these fiber connections, which are called axons, are sheathed in this sort of fatty insulating. It's literally like the insulation on an electrical cable, which is kind of white fatty stuff called myelin. Okay, so functional connectivity. Again, it's not really clear what that means just from the name, but it's the name that we're stuck with. It means how correlated are things with each other. Okay? So you can actually measure the functional connectivity between two things even if you don't know what their functions are. So that's why it's kind of not really, in my opinion, not really a very good name, but it means correlation between two things. And remember that correlation does not imply causation. Effective connectivity is, again, it's not clear from the name. This means trying to actually see, this is trying to get the causation, right? This is trying to actually say, is this area really driving this area, okay? Or is it being driven back by it? And you can see, I don't know if you can see those arrows here, okay? So there's no arrows on the functional connectivity because it's just saying, are these things connected to each other? Are they correlated with each other? But there are arrows on this. It turns out it's very difficult to actually figure out how strong these arrows are. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is there was a whole bunch of recent review papers in Science that came out last year about this topic. This one wasn't on the reading list. This one by Turk Brown, I'm going to show in the next slide, was in the reading list. So here's some more ways of looking at connectivity. I quite like this figure because it sort of shows a bunch of different things. So your standard. Can you read this text from the back? Maybe not all of it. So here's your standard sort of vanilla general linear model fMRI univariate activation, seeing for each given voxel does it go up or down in sync with the task. So here's the time courses of the task, condition A, condition B. You look at some voxels and you say, these voxels, this region lit up quite a lot for condition 1 and not as much for condition 2. So that's your sort of standard fMRI. I mean, one of the themes of the class has been that this is all fine and good in itself, but just knowing that some area lights up for some task doesn't tell you what that area does, how it works, how it's representing information. It also doesn't tell you how that area is talking to other brain areas. Okay? So here's what we've been talking about a lot, multivariate activation. You might, for instance, model a whole bunch of different conditions and look at their similarity relations to each other by looking at multiple voxels. I don't know if you can see there's a little grid here that's meant to sort of symbolize multiple voxels. You might put that in some kind of classifier. We've been talking about that a lot. Okay, this is a thing that we're going to, this is very, very popular at the moment and has been very popular for several years now. And I know some of you actually work on this. Resting state connectivity. This is literally someone's just lying in the scanner not doing anything. Okay, so which is a sort of an advantage because it's much easier to get someone not doing something than it is to get them doing something. Also, if you have multiple different sites, then they can all very easily run the same task because there is no task. You don't have to worry about the timing parameters of it or anything. So you just have people that rest in. I mean, their only task is to try not to move their head. Okay? And then you measure the activation of a bunch of voxels. This sort of like spontaneous. People often refer to it as intrinsic because it's not being driven by anything outside or not that you're aware of. And then you can say, let's look at these couple of these voxels or lots of the voxels and see how their time courses correlate with each other. Another thing you can do is you can also look at how time courses of voxels correlate with each other, where you actually are getting someone to do a task. Say you're getting someone to do this task here, where condition A comes on here and here, and condition 1 and condition 2 comes on here and here. Then you can say, to what degree do these different voxels, are they correlated with each other when someone is doing the task, when someone isn't doing the task? How does it vary between those two states? And here's where trying to pull out, where it's also interesting to try and pull out the difference between two things that are correlated because they're both being kicked at the same time by some third thing. This was one of the readings. I recommend this. I didn't set mini questions this week because, you know, I think we should be concentrating on the projects, but if you're only going to read one thing, I mean, of course you've already read them already, but if you're only going to read one thing, I would actually recommend this one. It's quite good. So, you know, you could have, if someone's actually doing a task and two voxels are both activated by the task, that's going to make them correlated with each other right there, right? Because they're both being kicked up when the task is on and they're both going down again when the task is off. So that's a type of correlation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these things are actually talking to each other. It just means that they're both being driven by the external stimuli. So, and this paper actually talks about a simple way you can actually get around that problem. You can just try and model, figure out how much activation is this being driven by the task, in other words, doing this standard analysis here, and then subtract that away, and then look at the correlation of what's left over, the residuals. So that's a way of trying to get rid of the external driver. And then if you want to, and that's sort of what this, it's an open question how valuable this is, but it might be worth looking into. That's the sort of big data part here. If you want to, you can look at how much everything connects with everything else. Okay? And if you've got, you know, 40,000 voxels, that gives you an awful lot of connections to look at. And so, you know, that would require a lot of number crunching. It's an open question what that will reveal, but it might reveal interesting stuff.
Raj?
Yeah.
So is it common for people to sort of just regress out the design matrix and just completely gut the time course of all
It's not,
the...
you know, this is not really my area, so I couldn't quite tell you how common it is. I know for a fact, I know for a fact that people do it.
Yeah.
And I know, in my personal opinion, it makes a great amount of sense to do it because you want to like remove, you know, the task-driven component. So people call it, I don't even know if it has an official name, and people might call it like residual connectivity. In this paper, Brown sort of talks about doing it, and I know for a fact that John Dylan Haynes has done this in the past. I mean, now he's more known for his like multivariate stuff, but in the past he's done, and he did that, and I think other people have done it too.
I guess so what's interesting is then, say you have two situations, a situation in which you compute functional connectivity, let's say over task data, and then you regress out the design matrix, let's say, and so all that's left over is just nothing, okay?
Well, the residuals.
Residuals, right?
Yeah, which actually may, I mean, the idea is that the residuals, you know, if after taking this away, it turns out that there's still some extra activation that's correlated across them, then you can say with a reasonable amount of confidence, you know, that correlation is not just being driven by them both being kicked by this external
And then if you do that, and then you compare it to, let's say, rest, where someone just does nothing for 6 minutes, or 10 minutes, or whatever, I guess, has anyone looked, to your knowledge, has anyone looked at doing those two
comparing those two things?
things?
That's a very good question.
You think like conceptually they might be...
I don't know the answer to that question, but check out the references of this paper, because he explicitly talks about doing that. I'm not even sure if he cites or even knows about, I don't know. It would be, like, I know that John Dylan Haynes used to do it, so he would be another person to look at. But check out the references in this paper, and if there's anyone who's done that, then it would probably be Todd Brown. You could shoot him an email or something. I mean, I'm sure Brad knows him, and Lauren knows him, and you could ask. You know, that would be that's a good question. Okay, so these are different ways of looking at connectivity. Now, one thing to know about, Oh, that's okay. Both of you have. We've got time.
So actually, well, maybe not much related to this one.
That's
everybody's talking about the big data. What does the big data mean?
That is a very, very good question.
Neuroimaging.
That is a very good question. I don't know if you read stuff by Gary Marcus. I'm a big fan of Gary Marcus's writing. He writes a lot for the New Yorker. Recently he had a New York Times. He's like a developmental psychologist at NYU. He writes brilliantly. He had an op-ed in New York Times recently saying, like, you know, 9 problems with big data. Big data is a sort of buzzword at the minute. I mean, it can mean anything, but there's definitely some interesting stuff going on. So big data usually means taking machine learning, taking large databases, especially online databases, and applying, you know, finding meaningful patterns, trying to find meaningful patterns in all that stuff. Okay? And so, and the reason, there's a couple of reasons why people are excited about that. One is because there really are. It turns out that there really are meaningful patterns in all that stuff. Okay? So for instance, you can find out very, very interesting things about how people interact in society and how people express their views by, mining millions of Twitter streams, for instance. That's a very active area of research in a minute. And for a long time you couldn't really do that because, it would have required, more computers than exist in the world, but now you can do it because computers are much more powerful. So that's another reason why people are interested. Another reason why people are interested because there really are quite good techniques in machine learning these days for actually finding meaningful patterns in large amounts of data, and people didn't really have that before either. So it's sort of a buzzword that has real substance behind it too. And as I expect you all know, there's actually a new institute for data science, big data, that's gotten quite a lot of funding here at University of Rochester, that's going to be essentially, hiring people, and also has a connection with Brain and Cognitive Science Department, hiring people to look at this kind of thing. Now, in the case of brain imaging, and I should, full disclosure, so Henry Kautz, who's the chair of computer science, is running that center, and I've been one of the speakers in one of his sort of sessions on, what would big data, and so I basically said, well, there's a sense in which fMRI is big data because, you have 40,000 voxels and you have, hundreds and hundreds of brain images, so you literally have, millions and millions of data points, and we know for a fact that there's interesting stuff going on in there, but it can be hard to pull it out. Now, there's simpler ways of pulling it out that actually work reasonably well, like, we know when the task was on, we know when the task was off, let's find out what was active for the task. And then there's, that definitely works, but it might not necessarily give you the most interesting answer. And then there's, slightly more complicated things of let's try and look at, say, information that's distributed across large areas of the brain in some high-dimensional sense. So that's more sort of big data-ish, because that's saying let's take a lot of brain imaging and let's apply some machine learning approach to it. So that's kind of what Tote Brown is saying here. He's saying in the instance of, if you want really big data from brain imaging, don't just look at the 40,000 voxels, but look at all the different pairwise interactions between those voxels, which would be, 1.6 billion or something. Okay, so that's big. That's big. Now, then the question is, okay, now you've got 1.6 billion pairwise voxel interactions. What are you going to do with it? So one of the challenges, and this was sort of one of the things that the Gary Marcus article was saying. One of the challenges is the aim is not just to find patterns; it's to find meaningful patterns. Now, what defines a meaningful pattern? Well, that's depends what you're interested in. But in this case, it'll be something that tells us something interesting about how the brain is working, how the brain is able to do this astounding thing of getting us to survive and deal with the world, right? So and I think it's an open question that whether this sort of approach really will answer that, but it might do. Who knows? You've got to try it and find out. So sometimes people use big data as just a sort of empty buzzword, but I think in this instance it's actually being used with some substance to it. But it is a very valid question, and people are actively debating this. What's the substance behind this sort of trending topic? I think there is some substance behind it, but I think there's probably also some hype that gets mixed in there too. But in this instance, I would say there is substance to it, in my personal view. Okay, you want to see an example of some big data? This is from before people called things big data. Okay, here's some big data. Okay, this is interconnections between brain areas. This was actually, I believe, the very first article published in the journal Cerebral Cortex. Fellman and Van Ness. This is sort of a picture that gets reproduced a lot. I'm sure you can't read all of the font in this or see all of the connections, but that's actually kind of the point. The point is that there's lots and lots of connections. Every single block here is a brain area, and every line is a connection between the brain areas, and believe it or not, this is just a subset of the connections, and almost all of these connections go in both directions, up and down. Okay? So you've got lots of different brain areas. Here's here's the LGN, here's primary visual cortex, here's different streams. Here's like the sort of dorsal stream of motion processing and parietal cortex and motor cortex, and here's the ventral stream of like V2, V4, inferior temporal cortex, and then it all comes together at the front of the head here. Here's prefrontal cortex. Okay, this is just, so there's actually some, this looks, when you first look at it, it just looks like a big tangle. Okay, but there's actually some structure there. There are real streams here. There's more connections between areas that are sort of closer together in the hierarchy than further together in the hierarchy. The fact that there even is a hierarchy, you can actually define that on the basis of the connections too. So, but when you just look at that, you're like, oh my word, that's just everything's connected to everything else. Okay? And that's actually not a bad summary. It's not actually really an untrue statement. It's almost a true statement to say that everything in the brain is connected to everything else. The brain is unbelievably richly interconnected. Okay? So if someone says, hey, why don't we actually look at the correlation of every voxel to every other voxel and see what we can find in there? That's not a ridiculous thing to suggest because, probably, even if it's not happening in a single one-step, monosynaptic pathway, if you're willing to cross a couple of intermediate steps, really everything is talking to everything else. So, one of the many, many things that we don't understand about the brain is, just what exactly is all this connectivity doing, especially the top-down connections. We have more of an idea of what the ones going from lower areas to higher areas are doing, but almost every brain area that receives input from an area also sends output back to it. Okay. So this is important to remember for trying to kind of think, well, just how much, how should we interpret this connectivity data that we look at? And this is actually especially relevant to, remember I was talking about trying to put arrows on here? Okay, so there's a reason actually why people talk more about functional connectivity, namely just seeing what's correlated with something else, than effective connectivity, which is trying to figure out to what degree is something driving something else. Because it's very, very, very difficult to show that something's really driving something else. And the reason is, it's very difficult to put these arrows on and put numbers on these arrows. And the reason is because if I say, okay, I want to figure out, what's driving area V4, even in this, which by the way is only a very partial wiring diagram, it doesn't look like it, but this is just a subset of the connections. I've got like 15, 16 different connections coming in here. So if I say I want to find out what's driving V4, if you really want to do that, you actually have to be able to measure not just what's coming in on all these connections, but what's being sent into all these connections. It's very, very difficult to do that. It's easier. I mean, it would be lovely if we really could understand exactly what's driving a given area. It's just challenging. It's easier to say that an area is correlated with another area than it is to say that there's a particular direction of information flow. But we'd love to find out about the direction of information flow. It's just difficult. So, but the basic idea, I already sort of showed this in a bit, but here's an example. This is from one of the other readings. This is a nice article too. This article is specifically talking about intrinsic functional connectivity, meaning resting state, where people are just sitting there and not doing anything. But the general logic of it is true whether someone's doing a task or not. So often what you do is you take some seed region, meaning I'm going to measure the time course from here, and that's going to be my regressor. I'm going to say what's correlated with that time course. So instead of saying I'm going to correlate everything with everything, you say I'm going to correlate everything, say, with one region, and that becomes a more tractable problem. So here's the time course that got pulled out from that region. And here's the stuff that was correlated with it. And the more brightly it's colored in, the more tightly it's correlated. This looks like some kind of motor cortex region, I think. And what you can see is that, I think this is motor cortex. Motor cortex on both areas is sort of correlated with it. So, it says that your different parts of motor cortex are sort of talking to each other, or at least they're sort of saying the same thing at the same time as each other. They may or may not be talking to each other. Even when you're just lying there doing nothing. And you do that by looking at the time course and finding stuff that correlates with it. Now remember that we've talked about how fMRI is kind of a slow measure, and the reason it's slow is because you're not directly measuring neural activation, which changes on the time course in milliseconds. You're measuring the change in blood oxygenation, which takes several seconds. So that's another challenging aspect of looking at connectivity, because if something really is driving something else, then if region, say V1 is driving V4, activation happens in V1, and 50 milliseconds later it's going to be making stuff happen in V4. You can't see that time difference of fMRI. There's ways you can try to get at it, but you're not directly going to measure that. If you look at other imaging modalities, such as EEG, MEG, then you can get a little bit closer to that. But even then, it's still difficult. Okay. So there's lots and lots of different things that you can look at with connectivity. Resting state connectivity is very popular at the minute, but it's also important to bear in mind that connectivity can change as a function of task. This is actually another reason why I like this Toad Brown article, because it makes a point of emphasizing this, even though resting state connectivity is so popular these days that people don't think as much necessarily about how things change as a function of task, but it does. And how could it not change as a function of task? The whole reason probably of why different brain areas talk to each other is so they can give information to each other. And why are they giving information to each other? Because that's what your brain needs to do right now in order to solve whatever task that you're trying to do in the world. So here's an example of looking at the connection of two different areas, the fusiform face area, FFA, parahippocampal place area, PPA. Remember how we were talking about these are areas which are sort of hotspots for responding to faces and hotspots for responding to sort of houses or the broader environment. They're just hotspots. There's actually responses to faces across almost all of this area of cortex and response to houses across almost all of this area of cortex. But if you had to pick the hotspots, then it would be these. Just like if you had to say, where in the United States is the economy, saying Wall Street is not a terrible answer, but it certainly doesn't mean that that's where all the economy is. Okay? So these are those two areas, and here's V4, which is this sort of intermediate form processing, form color processing area that's sort of like a mid-level visual area. Okay, so this is looking at the connectivity. He calls it background connectivity. I think that background connectivity is that thing where you take away the tasks and then just look at the residuals, but you'll have to check that. I may be getting that wrong, but I think that's what he means by that. So this font's probably a bit small to read, but when somebody's, so red is when somebody's paying attention to faces, and blue is when somebody's paying attention to scenes. And when somebody's paying attention to faces, it turns out that the face area, if you want to call it the face area, the face sort of Wall Street hotspot is talking with, or is more correlated with V4 than the place area is. But when you swap the condition and someone's paying attention to scenes or places instead, now this connection between V4 and the place area becomes more active. So the degree to which that becomes a high correlation. So the degree to which different areas are talking with each other is not just a sort of single static thing. And you wouldn't really expect it to be a single static thing, but it's important to bear that in mind. Here's an illustration actually, which I think is looking at MEG, or might actually even be neurophysiology, where they're looking at the degree to which there's synchrony at different frequencies. Okay, so different brain areas sort of tend to oscillate at different frequencies. You can't really look at that with fMRI, but you can look at it with neurophysiology or with EEG and MEG. And another way in which you can see that brain areas are sort of talking to each other, or at least saying the same thing as each other, is if they sort of oscillate in synchrony with each other. This is also an extremely active area of research, and there's a lot of evidence that, for instance, is involved in attention, especially this guy Pascal Fries has done a lot of work on that. So there's a similar sort of idea that you change the task, you get someone to respond either to, this might be a monkey actually, you get someone to get an animal to attend either to one patch or another patch, and the patch that they're responding to, that they're attending to, becomes more tightly in sync with some higher level area. So that's yet another way in which different brain areas are talking to each other. So if you're interested in connectivity, in functional connectivity, you will very quickly run into this idea that I already mentioned a little bit of the default mode network, which often gets referred to as just the DMN. People write that as if they assume, just assuming that people are going to know what DMN stands for. But if you ever see that unexplained, it probably stands for default mode network. And people often look at the default mode network and resting state connectivity or intrinsic connectivity. So what's this all about? Well, back in the day, people would look at, are the particular areas that are active for a given task. People still do that. And just for completeness, you usually say, oh, are there any areas that become less active for the task? And you just, flip the sign on your contrast that you're looking at. And people started to notice there's this weird thing that there's some areas that just seem to become less active no matter what task we give someone. And it tends to be this sort of like midline area here, sort of middle frontal, this sort of middle area nearer the back of the head, sort of precuneus type area, retrosplenial cortex it's also called, this sort of parietal stuff, there's some stuff here on temporal lobe here. These areas just again and again seem to become less active when you actually get someone to do something. It doesn't matter what that something is. It might be an attention task, it might be a memory task, it might be a language task. These areas seem to go down. So at first people are like, oh, well, that's a nuisance. We're interested in stuff that's going up. And then people, especially Randy Buckner, but also others, say, well, hang on a minute, maybe there's something interesting. Mark Rakel, another person. Maybe there's something interesting going on here. And they said, well, it appears like there's these multiple areas which seem to sort of go up and down together as a network.